Good evening, dear ones. I'm having such incredible gratitude to this Sangha. You all have been so beautiful this week, and it's been just a blessing to sit here and to look out upon you all. So thank you so much for your practice. So I was teaching on a retreat about a year or so ago, and I was meeting with a young student, and I was teaching with an elder teacher. And this yogi came to me and she said, you know, listening to this teacher speak, she's like a slow cooked stew. Like the spices are all melted together, the vegetables are so tender you don't have to worry about, breaking your tooth on them. It's just so smooth and so easy and so lovely. And then people like you, new teachers, you're like a crunchy tossed salad. She said, both are great before dinner, but and so you're going to get a nice crunchy salad tonight. So just want to put that out there. So I came to the Dharma about 13 years ago. I know that in this room, that can be a very long time ago, or yesterday for some folks in the room. And this is such a great time to be in the Dharma because we have such an amazing array of these seasoned teachers, this first generation of teachers that are around to offer us mentorship and beautiful teachings and just their history. And it's really a blessing to be able to sit next to them and be mentored by them and to learn from them. So this is we're at a really beautiful time in the Dharma right now. So I arrived on Monday, which was the last evening of the first week of the retreat, to acclimate, to meet some of you, to kind of be in the room and to see what was going on, and to see my dear friend Ian, who I hadn't seen in a while. And I didn't realize that when I got here, I would be staying in Ruth Dennison's kuti. That was a really big surprise to me. And when I got there and I walked in, it felt like my grandmother's home. You know what I mean, right? It was like, these big pieces of wooden furniture and beautiful rugs, and the things were like kind of antique and also like a flowered bedspread from the 80s. Just like this beautiful fusion of stuff. And it smelled like my grandmother's house. And it feels like such a warm, yummy place to land. And the next morning when the sun came up, I got a chance to get a real sense of where I was. And though it's much drier, this reminds me of sitting at centers in Africa. Most people on our lineage go to Asia to practice. For some reason, I've gone to Africa twice to study the Dharma. And the first time I went was to sit with Bhante Buddharakita in Uganda. Some of you might know who he is. He's extraordinary. And so it got me reflecting on that trip to Uganda and how I got there and the obstacles that were in the way and the things that fell away to allow me to be there. What motivated me to go to Uganda in the first place, and what allows me to continue to practice. This inquiry led me back to faith. In the classical teachings, there are 4 objects of faith. Tonight I will speak on the third, which is the confidence of the 3 jewels, of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So when I went to Uganda, I had already been sitting with the People of Color Sangha at New York Insight with Gina Sharp. And that had been my home Sangha for many years, but I had never been on a retreat. So when it was time for me to go on a retreat, I went with Gina, who I knew very well, and she's still my teacher, and Larry Yang, who's her best friend, and this new teacher, Bhante Buddharakita, who I'd never heard of. And he is a monk who was born and raised in Uganda. I had never seen a black man in robes before. really blew my mind. And yeah. And so when I first came to the Dharma, I didn't come necessarily, I wasn't wandering, I wasn't seeking, I didn't think. I was in this transitional place in my life. I had been working in the fashion industry in New York City for about a decade at that time. And I was transitioning out. So I was working at a holistic health center, very like hippy dippy place in New York. And I was, had just started teaching yoga and meditation to kids that were in jail. And so that's what I was doing, I was trying to figure out how to make this life work while living in New York City and letting go of my fashion world. And so I met Stan Greer, who was a beautiful gay black man who was working at the New York Open Center where I was working. And he was also a teacher with the Lineage Project who I ended up working with for a long time. He really took me under his wing and gave me the life that he was not going to continue to live. He was already dying of AIDS when I met him. And so he really trained me and mentored me and gave me all that I needed to begin this journey by myself. And so Stan introduced me to the Dharma. And he took me to New York Insight on the night of a People of Color potluck. And I walked in, and it was like being in the basement of a Baptist church. It was so familiar to me. People were like hugging and kissing and laughing and eating, and I was like, oh, I know this. I know this. I've done this. Like, it felt so like home to me. So I come from a Baptist family, and the church is sort of like the center of our lives. I think for about 3 generations, there's this little church in Ivy, Virginia, where my family was baptized in, married in, funeralized in. So a very deep-rooted connection to this church. When I go back to that church now, my parents have moved, they retired to the land that my grandfather was born on. So when I go back there, 5 out of the 6 people in the choir are my cousins. And like 50% of the congregation are my cousins. And so going to a place that had that sense of familiarity felt like I had found home again. So my first treat, I met Bhante Buddharakkhita. And I had never seen so much enthusiasm and joy from a grown man. It was like, you ever talk to a 4-year-old about Santa? Like, Santa's gonna bring me this, and Santa's gonna bring me that. And I was like, is that kind of energy coming from him? And it was so intoxicating. And not just intoxicating, but like, it was so pervasive. I wanted to be a part of that. I was like, yeah, that joy, like, how do I get that? And so at the end of the retreat, he says, I'm building a retreat center in Uganda. Everyone should come. And so I was like, that's a great idea. And so at the end of retreat, I went up to him and I said, I want to come to Uganda and study with you. And he was like, great. I'm like, are there Buddhists in Uganda? And he said, no. And I said, when can I come? And he said, January. And so that's what I did. And so it felt like the right thing to do. You know, and I did my research on Uganda, and there's some pretty beautiful things about the people and the culture and the land. There's this beautiful red clay. That's the same clay that is at my grandparents' home, that beautiful red clay. There's avocado trees everywhere, mangoes everywhere, very lush forest, and a very violent history. Being gay is illegal in Uganda. Sexism is rampant and legalized in Uganda. And so knowing this, there was something indescribable in my body that said, and you need to go. None of that scared me. There was no fear in my body. There was no doubt. I was ready. My heart was open, my mind was open, and everything in my body said, this is the time to do this. This is what Sharon Salzberg calls bright faith. So bright faith, this is the kind of faith that happens when our hearts are opened by encountering somebody or something that moves us. Perhaps we are inspired by a person's qualities of love or wisdom or kindness. Whether it's someone we know or a historical figure like the Buddha or another great being, we can begin to sense the possibility of another, happier way to live. Bright faith is a wonderful feeling and an important beginning, but it also is unreliable. We might encounter somebody one day and someone else another day, and be moved powerfully by each of them, but in opposite directions. We can get distracted by whatever influence comes into our lives next. So I definitely had some bright faith working at that moment. And I told my parents what I was going to do. They said, wait, you're going where? To do what? With a who? And I was like, yeah, I'm going to Uganda to study Buddhism with a monk. And so I arrived, and I very easily got into my daily routine there. I would wake with the sun. I would empty my waste into the outhouse. I would walk down the hill to pump water from the well. I would walk back up the hill, put water, heat it for my tea, put the other into a bucket, which I bathed in. I took bucket baths on the dirt floor of my little room that I stayed in. I would eat breakfast and study, and then Bhante would come and he would teach peace school with the local children. And then I would teach yoga to the children, and I would play with them. And because the Uganda Buddhist Center was still under construction, we spent many days going to hardware stores as well, getting hammers and nails and that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, we would sit on this hill overlooking Lake Victoria, and we would drink this really sugary ginger tea, this powdered form of ginger tea, and we would contemplate the day. He would leave, and I would go to bed under a mosquito net, knowing that I was protected by an armed guard just outside my door. So this went on for a few weeks. I got malaria, yada, yada, yada. And then I realized it was time for me to go home. And I started to panic. And I needed support and guidance on how to work with what I had learned, this beauty that I had experienced in my life in New York City. And so I asked Bhante for advice. And he said, your life has to be your practice, and your practice has to be your life. There can be no separation. And I thought, that is the worst advice I've ever gotten in my life. What did that mean? I had no idea what that meant. I had no desire to be a monk or a nun. I had no desire to be a teacher. I had no desire to do anything but go back to New York and hang out and drink with my friends, and also have this spiritual practice on the side. I had no idea how to bring these worlds together. But what he had asked of me was to have faith. He'd asked me to step into this practice with my full self. So faith is called the seed, and without it, the plant of spiritual life cannot grow. Without faith, we actually can't do anything at all. Faith is intuitive, it's primordial. It's not something that we learn, but something that we are born with. Newborns know that if they cry, they will get attention, they will get care, they will be fed. They know how to pull themselves up and try and figure out how to walk. It's like taking the training wheels off of our bike, applying to schools and saying yes to that first date. So all of these are acts of faith, a trusting that there is benefit of what's on the other side. And in the classical teachings, faith is one of the 5 faculties, or the 5 powers. So the 5 faculties are controlling factors because they control or master their opposites. Okay? So the 5 faculties or powers are faith, and it controls doubt. Energy, which controls laziness. Mindfulness, which controls heedlessness. Concentration, which controls distraction. and wisdom, which controls ignorance. So intellectually, faith is not substantiated by immediate, available, direct factual evidence, right? To believe in faith is beyond available evidence, and the believer must be willing and ready to fill up the gaps in the evidence with an attitude of patience and trust. Faith is, however, seen as a preliminary state, a primitive state, a merely provisional state to move forward. So this is where wisdom comes in to give us some ground in our faith. The etymology of the word faith, in Pali it is sada, is connected to the Latin word cor, which is also the root of courage, which means heart. So I love that, knowing that faith is not an intellectual thing or cerebral thing, but it's really a heart-centered thing. It comes from the heart, it comes from this body. So it implies resolute and courageous acts of will. It combines a steadfast resolution that one will do a thing with a self-confidence that one can do a thing. Emotionally, faith is an attitude of serenity and lucidity. Its opposites here is worry, the state of being troubled by many things. It is said that someone who has faith loses the 5 terrors. And these 5 terrors are that one ceases to worry about the necessities of life, about loss of reputation, about death, unhappy rebirth, and the impression he may make on an audience. And socially, faith involves trust and confidence in the Buddha and the Sangha. By going for refuge to the Buddha and the Sangha, one turns from the visible and tangible to the invisible and the elusive. By placing one's reliance on spiritual forces, one gains the strength to disregard public opinion and social discouragement. Some measure of defiant contempt for the world and its ways is inseparable from spiritual life. Faith requires a considerable capacity for renunciation. And so when I read that line, that some measure of defiant contempt for the world and its way is inseparable from spiritual life, I thought, that makes sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to me. So wisdom is needed here to keep faith in check. It gives confidence to faith when it's in its form of doubt. And faith is needed to keep wisdom from being too rigid and practical. Historically, I looked upon doubt as a cue for me to stop, to turn away from, to not engage and to be scared of. But with wisdom and discernment, I have learned for myself that they are actually an invitation to pause, to investigate, to move towards this great unfolding. Pema Chodron says that fear is a natural reaction to moving closer to our truth. And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says that faith is taking the first step, even when you can't see the whole staircase. When we move towards our doubt, towards our fears, to see them, to know them, to cultivate an intimate relationship with them, we can see that these are teachers that are calling us in. And though sada is usually translated as faith, it is not to be meant as a dogmatic belief. In the Buddha's teachings, he often argued against following authority and tradition. Instead, a person should themselves derive a moral judgment based on their own experience. And this is what I love so much about this practice, is that the proper Buddhist attitude is one of skepticism, is one of doubt, of inquiring, of being inquisitive. And the Buddha offered this phrase, ehipassiko, come and see for yourself. So don't trust what I say. Don't trust what people tell you. But go and experience this and know it so it is your own truth. So that you know it in your own body. And so for 45 years after his awakening, the Buddha traveled a world offering these teachings to anyone who wanted to listen, regardless of their gender or their caste. In the Kalama Sutta, which is in the Anigatara Nikaya, he says, don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability or by the thought. This contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these mental qualities are skillful, these mental qualities are blameless, these mental qualities are praised by the wise, these mental qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to welfare and to happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. So another way of saying this is, when you know for yourself that these things are good, that these things are not blamable, when things are praised by the wise, undertaken and observed, these things lead to benefit and happiness. Enter on and abide in them. So live in them. During the time of the Buddha, personal verification was valued much higher than learning from teachers or from doctrine. So there really was so much more faith given when you know something for yourselves. I think we're really missing something in this culture of getting all these degrees. I think that we should stop, just study the Dharma. And though I had fond memories as a young person in the church, this is ultimately why I left the church when I was 12. As a kid, I was pretty sheltered from the hatred in the world. I had never had a direct experience with racism or sexism. I didn't know about homophobia. I didn't know about anti-Semitism. I didn't know about xenophobia and all the other forms of hate that were in the world. And from the pulpit, I was hearing this hate from our preacher, especially in the form of homophobia. And so what I did understand at that age was that I was living in a culture of dominance. There was dominant culture at play there. He had read scripture that he believed, interpreted it for himself, and then chose to tell us what he felt about it, not inviting us into the inquiry, into the investigation to know for ourselves. So this is what dominance culture does. And so I was 12 years old when I sat my parents down and told them that I was leaving the church. I sat them down and I was like, look, here's what's going on. I have a lot of questions and I'm hearing a lot of hate, and that's not what I learned at home, and it's really confusing. And so until the adults can get it together, I'm going to stop going to church. And my parents said, okay. My parents are amazing. I truly believe that I chose my parents. I truly, truly believe that. And so we talked about homophobia at that time, and my mom said, it doesn't matter who you love. They can be green or purple or a man or a woman. It doesn't matter, as long as they care for you and you care for them. And as I played this scene over in my head as I've gotten older, it's like a movie. There's a cutaway of my mom being like, I know you're probably gay, and that's okay. In retrospect, I think that's what she was secretly saying to me. And so my parents said, you can leave the church, and they wanted me to really hold on to a spiritual life. And so my mother asked me to remember to always treat others as I would have them treat me. So the 8 precepts is what she asked me to keep before I even knew about the 8 precepts. So again, Sharon Salzberg about faith. She says, mature faith is anchored in our own experience of the truth, centered in the deeper understanding of the nature of the mind and body that we come to in meditation practice. This deeper level of faith is called verified faith, which means it is grounded in our own experience. The inspiration and confidence we feel arises from our experience, rather than coming from someone outside of ourselves. It is a great turning point in our spiritual lives when we go from an intellectual appreciation of a path to the heartfelt confidence that says, yes, it is possible to awaken, and I can too. A tremendous joy accompanies this confidence. When we place our hearts upon the practice, the teachings come alive. That turning point, which transforms an abstract concept of a spiritual path into our own personal path, is faith. So once I made the decision to fully be in my spiritual life, I began to really know how important and impactful my spiritual relationships have been. Every now and then I do a download of all the folks who have supported my spiritual growth throughout the years, through their generosity, their time, energy, humor, and love. They're giving me a shoulder to cry on when I'm freaking out, when I am doubting and thinking, I should go back to graduate school and get a real career. So their continued faith in me is the most important part of this relationship with my spiritual friends. In the Upada Sutta, which is half of the Holy Life, just one of my favorite suttas, it says, I have heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was living among the Sakyans. Now there is a Sakyan town named Sakkara. There Venerable Ananda went to the Blessed One, and on arrival, having bowed down to the Blessed One, sat to one side. As he was sitting there, Venerable Ananda said to the Blessed One, this is half of the holy life, Lord. Admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie. And I imagine the Buddha being very dramatic and saying, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. This is my own view of how that went down. Admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. When a monk has admirable people as friends, companions, and comrades, he can be expected to develop and pursue the Noble Eightfold Path. And though this line of reasoning, one may know how admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. It is in dependence on me as an admirable friend that being subject to birth have gained release from birth. That being subject to aging have gained release from aging. That being subject to death have gained release from death. That being subject to sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair have gained release from sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. It is through this line of reasoning that one may know how admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. And so he's speaking to the third foundation of mindfulness, to the cessation of suffering. Yes, we will still have the pain of being born, of aging, getting sick, and dying, pain, distress, and despair. But with the wisdom and support of the Sangha, we see that we don't have to add that second arrow which leads to the suffering. The Sangha reminds us that to hold both, that there is suffering and then there is the alleviation of suffering. That is what it's like to be born into this precious human form. The suffering within us and around us are linked. Thich Nhat Hanh says that we cannot identify anger, jealousy, despair within ourselves, that we need to encounter Sangha to recognize it. If you don't know the roots of these afflictions, you cannot see the path leading to their cessation. And that's why suffering is very important to our practice. And I don't want us to get fixed too tightly on what Sangha looks like. It's not just who we sit next to on retreat or in our home Sanghas. Sangha continues to manifest in many different ways. Thich Nhat Hanh says that the trees, water, air, birds, and so on can all be members of our Sangha. A beautiful walking path may be a part of our Sangha. A good cushion to sit on can also be part of our Sangha. So he says that anything that can support our practice is our Sangha. When I was living in New York, I would get Fresh Direct to deliver my groceries for me. And I would have them deliver my groceries at 6 a.m. to make sure that I was up and I could meditate while my dishes laundry, while my groceries were being delivered. And so one day I was sitting in practice and my doorbell rang and I went, oh my gosh, Fresh Direct is my Sangha. This beautiful epiphany. So this is the Sangha River by Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm sure a lot of you know this. If we are a drop of water and we try to get to the ocean as only an individual drop, we will surely evaporate along the way. The Sangha is your river. In our daily practice, we learn how to be a part of this river. We learn how to look with Sangha eyes, how to walk with Sangha feet, how to feel with a Sangha heart. We have to train ourselves to see the happiness of our own community as our own happiness, and the difficulties of our communities as our own difficulties. Once we are able to do this, we will suffer much less. We feel stronger and more joyful. As members of a Sangha, we can develop our individual talent and our individual potential, and at the same time, contribute to and participate in the talent and happiness of the entire group. Nothing is lost, and everyone wins. A Sangha has the power to protect and carry us, especially in difficult times. We have a better chance to develop our potential and protect ourselves. So what Thich Nhat Hanh is pointing to is this interdependence, this interconnectedness, this resonance. And as folks who have historically been displaced, separated, and oppressed, meaning folks of color, folks with marginalized identities, being queer folks, being dykes. I'm really going to reclaim that word, by the way. We've learned that our only chance of survival is if we stick together, to find those other drops of water and to create an ocean, and to do it together. A few years ago, a group of women from my Sangha wanted to begin to explore the divine feminine, the erotic and the sensual in our practice, and also to be in deeper connection with each other as our lives became busier and fuller. These are women who I've been studying with and sitting with in a Sangha for the entire 13 years of my practice, and we've now moved on to be teachers and community leaders. And so we started out as a secret Sangha, and we called ourselves the Rogue Yin Feminine Dharma Conspiracy. And so we called ourselves rogue because we refused to be in anybody's container. So we didn't want people to know about us. We didn't want to ask New York Insight to give us space. So we chose to be rogue, to always meet in someone's home and to break bread together. Yin, because we wanted the energy of the feminine. And we initially we thought about calling ourselves like a women's, and people had different experiences and expressions of their bodies, and so the word women didn't really fit. So yin encaptured the energy that we were trying to have. And feminine, because we wanted to explore the divine feminine, which is in our lineage. Dharma, because we were definitely going to be studying some Dharma. And conspiracy, because the word conspiracy means to breathe together. And that's what we were going to do. We were going to breathe together. So I've traveled to South Africa to practice with these folks. We spent a month with Tanissa and Kitisaro in practice. We've held each other through sickness and death. And since making this commitment to them, I've been living with a more open and tender heart. And though I've always loved my spiritual friends, my Sangha, I've begun to really feel how much of my part of my body they have become. Our happiness, our joys, our sorrows are all tied up together. Thich Nhat Hanh says that it's possible that the next Buddha will not take the form of an individual. The next Buddha may take the form of a community practicing, understanding, and loving kindness, a community practicing mindful living. This may be the most important thing that we can do for our survival of the earth. Reverend Jinzu Earthland Manuel, who is a Zen Buddhist priest in the Suzuki Roshi lineage, and she's also a Black queer woman, writes us about Sangha. She says, our Sangha friends are there to assist us by reflecting back to us the ways in which we respond to the events of life. This reflection doesn't mean that these friends are to sit in judgment of our actions or inform us of any wrongdoings. The reflection is silent. It is in the way we see ourselves in each other. When a friend falters or experiences discomfort, we, in turn, are there to witness the faltering and the discomfort, sensing the familiarity of their situation and our own life. When a Sangha member is happy, we see the joy in our own lives. Many have said to me that they do not need Sangha. My response has been, then where will you go when you begin to experience liberation? Who will know the journey you have taken and your vow to be awake? And I want to end with something that my dear friend Dara Williams, who is an amazing Dharma teacher, part of the rogue yin feminine Dharma conspiracy, she says that faith is not learning something new, but more of a remembering of something that we've already known. So each time I bring my palms together and touch my head to the earth, I'm reminded of my faith in my practice, my faith in the possibility of liberation and the freedom from suffering. I bow down to honor the Buddha, not just the Bodhisattva Siddhartha Gautama who awakened to the alleviation of suffering and continued to share these practices to everyone for the rest of his life. I bow down to all of my teachers, whose shoulders I stand upon to sit here tonight in front of you. I bow down to the Dhamma, these teachings of freedom and liberation, and the invitation to speak them in my vernacular so that folks of color and queer folks, folks experiencing homelessness, and folks living with addiction can know the Dharma for themselves. And I bow down to the Sangha, the next Buddha. So thank you for your kind attention. So we'll just sit together for a few minutes. And though our faith might waver from time to time, may we always remember that we can take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha.